On the morning of March 29th, 1888, every pharmacist in Atlanta closed their counters, set down their mortars and pestles, and walked into the raw Georgia spring to attend a funeral. The man they buried had, just 2 years before, sold a formula scrawled on a piece of paper for $500 in cash. He was broke when he signed it. He was broke when he died. The product that formula eventually made possible is, at this moment, consumed somewhere on this planet roughly 2 million times per hour. His name was John Stith Pemberton. The drink was Coca-Cola. But this documentary is not about John Pemberton. Not entirely. This documentary is about what happened to the family that controlled what came after him. It is the story of the Candler family, the Woodruff family, the shareholders, the trustees, and the dynasty that was handed the single greatest commercial asset in the history of consumer goods, and what they chose to do with it. Because the greatest trick the Coca-Cola story ever played on the people who owned it was not the theft. It was not the betrayal. It was not the litigation or the secrecy or the boardroom wars. The greatest trick was this. The moment any member of the family decided they were done being patient, the moment they decided the money in front of them was too large to ignore, the market quietly moved on without them. They chose liquidity over legacy. They chose the spectacular exit over the slow compounding of generational wealth. And the shares they sold, shares that felt like a windfall in their time, became the measuring stick of every financial mistake ever made in the American South. This is not a story about greed, exactly. It is not a morality play. The people in this story were not villains. They were human beings who looked at a number and could not see past it. They looked at a mansion and could not see through it. They looked at a sale price and did not understand that the thing they were selling had barely begun to grow. The formula itself was not the asset. The asset was patience. And patience, as it turned out, was the only thing the Coca-Cola family could never quite hold on to. What you are about to hear is the full, documented, historically sourced account of how the families most intimately connected to the rise of Coca-Cola. From its murky origins in a Confederate veteran's apothecary to its emergence as the most recognized commercial brand on Earth, accumulated staggering wealth, and then, through a series of decisions that seemed entirely rational at the time, distributed nearly all of it back into a world that no longer needed them. The drink outlasted them all. The stock never stopped climbing. And the houses they bought with the proceeds? Most of them are gone. We begin not with the drink, but with the wound. Before we continue, let me say something important. There are thousands of loud stories online, but very few that slow down long enough to tell the truth properly. This channel exists for people who still care about history being told with depth, patience, and respect. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this month. Not for numbers, but to prove that there are still people who value thoughtful storytelling over noise. If you believe stories like this deserve to be preserved and told the right way, then subscribe. Not just to support the channel, but to be part of what we're building here. Now, let's return to the moment everything began to unravel. Chapter 1. The wound that started everything. In the spring of 1864, a Confederate cavalry officer named John Stith Pemberton was riding toward the Battle of Columbus, Georgia, one of the final engagements of the American Civil War, fought after the peace had already been effectively decided elsewhere. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. The men still fighting in Columbus were dying for a cause that had already been adjudicated in courts of blood hundreds of miles north. But they rode anyway. That was the culture. That was the expectation. During the engagement, a Union saber found Pemberton across the chest. The wound was severe. It opened him in a way that would never fully close. Not the physical scar, which healed after a fashion, but the relationship between his body and pain that the injury established. The wound nearly killed him. The morphine they gave him to manage the pain would finish the job slowly, over the next 23 years. This is the origin story that the Coca-Cola Company has never been entirely comfortable telling, and yet it is the truest one. John Pemberton was a pharmacist, a trained chemist by the standards of his era, a man who had spent his professional life experimenting with botanical compounds and medicinal tonics in the back rooms of Atlanta drugstores. He was not an eccentric. He was not a dilettante. He was a serious practitioner trying to solve a serious problem. His own dependence on the opiates that had kept him functional in the years after the war. The late 19th century was awash in patent medicines, bottled remedies that promised everything from relief of nervous disorders to the management of chronic pain. Most of them were fraudulent. Many of them were dangerous. A significant number were themselves addictive. Pemberton moved through this landscape not as a huckster, but as a genuinely curious scientist who believed, as many pharmacists of his era did, that the natural world contained compounds capable of replacing the opiate therapies that were quietly destroying his generation of veterans. He was wrong, as it turned out. The drink he eventually landed on contained no morphine replacement. It contained, in its original form, a small quantity of cocaine derived from coca leaves, and a significant quantity of caffeine derived from cola nuts. Whether this combination meaningfully addressed his own physical dependency is not recorded. What is recorded is that by the mid-1880s, Pemberton was a sick man, financially ruined by years of failed experiments, operating out of a rented laboratory space in Atlanta, surviving on the hope that the next formula would be the one. In 1886, it was the precise story of how Pemberton developed the syrup that would become Coca-Cola has been debated by historians for over a century. The formula itself, the famous merchandise 7X, that the company guards with operatic secrecy to this day, was developed through a series of iterative experiments in Pemberton's backyard. He was trying to create a temperance drink, a nerve tonic, a beverage that could be sold through pharmacies and soda fountains as a medicinal product. What he produced was something that tasted, against all reasonable expectation, genuinely good. Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta began serving it from their soda fountain in May 1886. The price was 5 cents a glass. Total sales for the first year amounted to approximately $50. The ingredients alone cost him $70. He was already losing money. He was already dying. The cancer had spread through his stomach by 1887. The morphine had long since spread through everything else. He had debts he could not pay and partners who were beginning to understand that the asset they held, this syrup, this formula, this small and improbable bottle of brown concentrate, was worth more than any of them had yet calculated. Pemberton characteristically moved first. He began selling shares of the business in fractions to anyone who would buy them. He needed the cash. He needed it immediately. He could not wait. He left behind a widow with nothing and a son who had inherited his father's worst afflictions. And he left behind a formula. That formula, which he sold in pieces to multiple parties simultaneously in one of the most legally chaotic transactions in American commercial history, would eventually be assembled in full by a man named Asa Griggs Candler for a total purchase price of approximately $2,300. Candler was a pharmacist too. He was also, unlike Pemberton, constitutionally patient, relentlessly promotional, and entirely free of morphine dependency. He understood the product differently. He did not see a tonic. He saw a brand. Within 3 years, he had turned Pemberton's dying experiment into a company. Within 10 years, he had turned the company into an institution. Within 20 years, the institution had become something that had no precise precedent in American commercial life. And then, with the whole extraordinary structure at its most valuable, the Candler family made the decision that would define their legacy far more durably than any single act of creation. They sold it. Chapter 2. The Methodist and His Millions. Asa Griggs Candler was a deeply religious man. This is not a peripheral fact. It is the engine of everything he did, and the source of nearly every catastrophic decision his children would later make. He was a devout Methodist who believed, with the sincerity of someone who had never been seriously tested on the matter, that wealth was a form of stewardship. God had given him the Coca-Cola Company as surely as God had given Solomon his temple. It was not a commercial achievement. It was a sacred trust. This framing made him an extraordinary businessman for exactly as long as it reinforced his instinct for discipline and expansion. Candler refused to pay dividends for years, plowing every dollar of profit back into advertising, distribution, and the acquisition of bottling rights. He printed millions of free coupons for Coca-Cola when coupon marketing was barely a recognized practice. He gave away promotional clocks, urns, calendars, and serving trays to pharmacies and soda fountains across the country. He was advertising the brand years before the country had a coherent theory of what advertising was. By 1892, Candler had formally incorporated the Coca-Cola Company with a capitalization of $100,000. The figure was almost immediately obsolete. By 1902, the company's advertising budget alone exceeded $100,000 annually. Sales were growing at a pace that the company's own bookkeeping could barely track. Candler, characteristically, did not celebrate. He built the syrup plant on Edgewood Avenue in Atlanta. He built distribution networks across the American South, and then pushed them north and west with a methodical consistency that his competitors found baffling and then terrifying. He controlled the syrup supply with absolute authority, selling it at prices that ensured bottlers would profit, but never profit enough to threaten his own margins. The business model was elegant in the way that all truly durable business models are. It appeared simple to the people paying for it and was fiendishly complex to anyone who tried to replicate it. He also built himself a mansion. Several, in fact. The Callenwold Estate in Druid Hills, Atlanta, which Candler developed as a residential neighborhood and named for his own family home, stands today as one of the finest examples of early 20th century Tudor Revival architecture in the American South. It cost a figure that seemed extraordinary in its time, and that would be, by comparison to what the Coca-Cola stock used to buy it was eventually worth, essentially free. Here is the irony the Candler family could not see until it was too late. Every dollar Asa spent on real estate was a dollar not compounding inside the company he had built. Every acre of land, every mansion facade, every church donation. And Candler was legendarily generous with churches. Was a withdrawal from an account that was growing faster than he was spending it, but would not grow fast enough to absorb what came next. What came next was the bottle. In 1899, two Chattanooga lawyers named Benjamin Thomas and Joseph Whitehead approached Candler with a proposition. Let them buy the rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola in the United States for a national bottling operation. Candler, whose vision of the product was tied entirely to the soda fountain, who had never seriously imagined Coca-Cola as a product that traveled in glass containers to people's homes, sold them the national bottling rights for $1. Not $1 per case. Not $1 per territory. $1. Total. He signed that contract without a single reread. Historians have spent decades trying to determine whether Candler understood what he was giving away. The weight of the evidence suggests he did not. He viewed the soda fountain as the future of beverage distribution. He viewed the bottle as a curiosity. He was so thoroughly wrong that the bottling franchise system he handed away for $1 became, within 30 years, the single most valuable distribution infrastructure in American commercial history. It was the first great miscalculation of the Coca-Cola dynasty. It would not be the last. By 1916, Asa Candler had stepped back from daily operations. He was 65 years old, enormously wealthy by any standard except the one that would later be applied to his own company, and increasingly interested in civic projects, land development, and the political life of Atlanta. He had donated the land for Emory University. He had served as mayor of Atlanta. He was, in the eyes of Georgia society, something close to royalty. He was also, quietly, losing control of the institution he had built. His children were watching. His children had been watching for years. And his children had not inherited their father's patience. They had inherited his wealth, his sense of entitlement, and his absolute certainty that they understood the value of what they held. What they had not inherited was the discipline that had created it. They looked at the company and saw not a living, compounding asset that required tending. They saw a number, a very large number, a number that converted into something tangible, houses, land, political influence, status, would secure the Candler name for generations. They were right about the number. They were catastrophically wrong about what to do with it. Chapter 3. The Sale That Should Never Have Happened. In 1919, while Asa Candler was distracted by a bitter and very public divorce proceeding that had scandalized Atlanta society, his children sold the Coca-Cola Company. They sold it without his knowledge. They sold it without his consent. They sold it, according to the most sympathetic historical interpretation available, because they genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. The less sympathetic interpretation, which the facts support with uncomfortable precision, is that they sold it because $25 million was a number that they could not see past. The buyer was a syndicate of investors led by an Atlanta banker and investor named Ernest Woodruff. The price was $25 million for the entirety of the Coca-Cola Company. To give that number its proper context, by 1919, the company was already generating millions in annual profit. The syrup was being sold in every state in the Union. The bottling network that Candler had inadvertently gifted away for $1 was creating millionaires across the South. The brand recognition that Candler's decades of promotional spending had built was essentially incalculable. $25 million was a severe undervaluation. It was not a minor miscalculation. It was a historic one. But the Candler children could not see that. All they could see was $25 million. In 1919, for a family that had started with a few $1,000s in apothecary stock, the number was not merely large. It was beyond the grammar of their ambition. They took it. Asa Candler, when he learned what his children had done, reportedly sat in silence for a long time. He had built the company over 30 years through discipline and abstinence and promotional ingenuity. He had refused repeatedly to sell shares to investors who offered him extraordinary premiums. He had protected the formula, the brand, and the distribution network with a ferocity that those who worked for him described as almost religious. And his children had sold it in a private transaction while he was occupied with his divorce. He never fully forgave them. He never publicly condemned them either. He was a Methodist. He believed in family. He believed in dignity. And he was, by this point, an old man who understood that there was no mechanism available to him for undoing what had been done. The Woodruff family, now in control of the Coca-Cola company, faced immediate challenges. The company had been sold with significant debt. The purchase had been financed partially through a bond offering that required Coca-Cola to generate consistent returns just to service the interest payments. Ernest Woodruff's son, Robert Winship Woodruff, who would eventually take the reins of the company in 1923, inherited not just the greatest commercial brand in American history, but a balance sheet that could have strangled it. Robert Woodruff was 23 years old when his father's syndicate bought the company. He was 33 when he became its president. He was, by every account that survives him, one of the most formidable business minds of the 20th century. He was also, critically, patient in a way that the Candler children had not been, and that his own father's transaction had not rewarded. He did not need to be told what the Candlers had failed to understand. He had watched them fail in real time. He took control of the company with the explicit intention of never making the same mistake, of never confusing the present value of an asset with the value it would have if left to grow undisturbed. He would eventually hold the company for 60 years. He would transform it from a regional American phenomenon into a global institution. He would, by the time of his death in 1985, be considered one of the great figures of 20th century American commerce. He would also, in his own way, demonstrate that even the most disciplined custodians of an extraordinary asset could make decisions that looked, in retrospect, like gifts to whoever came after them. The pattern was not a character flaw. It was structural. The company was simply growing faster than any individual, any family, any dynasty could fully contain. The Coca-Cola Company was an entity that belonged, ultimately, to no one. Or rather, it belonged to anyone patient enough to hold it. And patience, in a family accustomed to seeing its own name on buildings, was a quality that required constant, active renewal. Some renewed it. Many did not. Chapter 4. Robert Woodruff and the Architecture of Global Dominance. To understand how large Robert Woodruff's achievement was, you must first understand how small the canvas was when he started. In 1923, Coca-Cola was predominantly an American product. It was sold in most American states and had made tentative inroads into a few international markets, but it was not a global phenomenon. It was a profitable syrup manufacturer with an aggressive domestic distribution network and a brand identity that, while strong, was far from the universal symbol it would later become. Woodruff took all of this and, through a combination of institutional discipline and extraordinary marketing instinct, remade it. His first major move was addressing the quality problem. Coca-Cola's bottling network, precisely because it had been sold off in franchise pieces by Candler for essentially nothing, was a patchwork of independently operated facilities that varied enormously in their quality control. The drink that a consumer received in Memphis might taste noticeably different from the one consumed in Cincinnati. Woodruff understood, before most consumer brands had articulated the concept, that consistency was not merely desirable, it was the brand itself. He imposed quality standards across the bottling network with a persistence that the franchise operators resisted and then grudgingly respected. He invested in refrigeration technology at a time when cold beverages were still a novelty in many markets. He standardized the iconic contoured bottle, the hobble skirt design, patented in 1915, which had been created specifically to distinguish Coca-Cola from imitators, as the universal vessel for the brand's identity. Then he went to work on the world. Woodruff's internationalization of Coca-Cola was not a gradual geographic expansion. It was a strategic invasion. He used the infrastructure of American military and commercial power as his distribution network. When the United States government was present, Coca-Cola followed. American soldiers in both World War I's aftermath and World War II's theaters were supplied with Coca-Cola by a company that understood, with a clarity that its competitors could not match, that brand loyalty formed under conditions of emotional intensity was loyalty that lasted a lifetime. The famous directive that Robert Woodruff issued during World War II, that every American soldier, wherever they were in the world, should be able to buy a Coca-Cola for 5 cents, was not charity. It was the single most effective global marketing campaign ever executed, and the United States government subsidized it. By the end of the war, 64 Coca-Cola bottling plants had been established in areas of active American military operation. When the war ended, those plants became the seeds of a permanent global distribution infrastructure. The soldiers went home. The bottling plant stayed. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was not merely an American product sold internationally. It was an international product that happened to be American. The distinction matters. It was consumed in over 100 countries. It was recognized in markets where the local population could not read the English lettering on the bottle, but recognized the shape, the color, the red label, the white script. The brand had achieved something that even its most enthusiastic advocates in 1919 could not have imagined. It had become a visual language. All of this growth, all of this expansion, all of this patient, methodical construction of global dominance. It was happening to a company that the Candler family had sold for $25 million. The market capitalization of the Coca-Cola Company in 1950 was approximately $1 billion. The market capitalization of the Coca-Cola Company in 1980 was approximately $4 billion. The market capitalization of the Coca-Cola Company in 2023 exceeded $250 billion. The Candler children's $25 million, had it remained in the company as equity, would have represented a generational fortune so large that its management would itself have required a staff of professionals. The houses that the $25 million actually bought them were, by the 1980s, worth a fraction of what they'd been purchased for in real terms. Some of those houses no longer exist. Chapter 5. The Formula in the Vault and the Myth That Sold It. At some point in the early 20th century, the Coca-Cola Company made a decision that was simultaneously a sound legal strategy, a brilliant marketing move, and a piece of cultural mythology that has outlasted nearly every other brand narrative in commercial history. They decided to keep the formula secret. This requires some unpacking, because the secrecy of the Coca-Cola formula has been so thoroughly mythologized that it is now difficult to separate the business reality from the legend that the company's marketing apparatus has spent a century constructing. The formula is real. The secrecy is real. The vault in Atlanta's World of Coca-Cola Museum, where a version of the formula is currently stored, is a genuine physical object. But the narrative that surrounds it, the claim that only 2 living people know the formula at any time, that it has never been written down in complete form, that its ingredients have never been fully reverse engineered, is a story that serves commercial purposes as much as factual ones. What is historically certain is this. Pemberton's original formula was purchased in fragments by Asa Candler. Candler assembled those fragments, modified the formula over time, and then made the decision to protect it as a trade secret rather than a patent. This was a legally sophisticated choice. Patents expire. Trade secrets, legally protected, do not. The formula could not be patented indefinitely, but it could be kept secret indefinitely, provided the company maintained the security measures that trade secret law requires. Candler maintained them. Woodruff intensified them. And somewhere in the process of legal protection, the secrecy acquired a mythology that became, itself, more valuable than any patent could have been. Consider what the myth accomplished. It ensured that every article written about the formula, and there have been thousands, was implicitly an advertisement for the product. It created a narrative of irreplaceability that consumers internalized without being asked to. It transformed a beverage whose primary ingredients, carbonated water, sugar, caramel coloring, and a proprietary blend of flavoring extracts, were known to the broader food science community into an object of genuine mystery. The myth made the mystery feel meaningful, and the mystery made the brand feel irreplaceable. In 1985, the Coca-Cola Company made the single most spectacular unforced error in the history of consumer branding. They changed the formula. The New Coke episode has been analyzed so thoroughly by business historians, marketing academics, and consumer psychologists that it has become a case study in what happens when a company confuses the product with the brand. The company's internal research had shown, correctly, that in blind taste tests, the new, sweeter formula was preferred by a majority of consumers over the original. The research was methodologically sound. The conclusion drawn from it was not. The conclusion was that consumers preferred the taste of new Coke. The correct conclusion, which took the company approximately 79 days of catastrophic consumer backlash to arrive at, was that consumers did not want to prefer new Coke. They wanted to prefer classic Coke. They had been preferring it for 99 years, and they had, in that time, built an emotional relationship with it that was not about the specific formulation of the syrup. It was about continuity, identity, and the comfort of the familiar. You cannot replicate 99 years of brand loyalty with a sweeter recipe. You cannot market your way out of telling 100 years of customers that the thing they loved was actually worse than the thing you are now selling them. The backlash was immediate, organized, and ferocious. Consumers in Atlanta wept in the streets. Hotlines received thousands of calls per day from people who sounded, by multiple accounts, as though they were grieving a death in the family. Cases of classic Coke were hoarded. Protest groups formed. A senator from Georgia gave a floor speech. The drama was genuine. Within 79 days, Coca-Cola Classic was back on the shelves. The company has since claimed that the episode was a marketing masterstroke, that the outcry proved the depth of consumer loyalty and ultimately strengthened the brand. This is the kind of explanation that companies generate when they need to convert a catastrophic mistake into a success narrative, and it is not entirely wrong. The publicity generated by the new Coke episode was worth hundreds of millions in earned media. The return of classic Coke was treated by consumers as a cultural event. Sales did increase. But the episode also revealed something that the company's leadership found uncomfortable. The brand was, in a very real sense, no longer theirs. It belonged to the people who drank it. It had become a cultural institution so thoroughly internalized by its consumers that any attempt to alter its fundamental character would be treated as a violation, not merely a disappointment. The family that had created it, sold it, and profited from it had not anticipated this. They had thought of Coca-Cola as a product. It had become a shared mythology, and shared mythologies cannot be owned. They can only be stewarded. Chapter 6, The Woodruff Paradox, The Man Who Gave It Away. Robert Woodruff lived to be 95 years old. He was born in 1889 and died in 1985, a span of life that allowed him to watch the company he had acquired as a young man become, in the final decades of his life, something so large that its scale was difficult to conceptualize using ordinary economic language. He did not cash out. He did not diversify into real estate or political office or the other temptations that had pulled the Candler family away from their equity. He held, and he gave. The paradox of Robert Woodruff is that the man most responsible for the accumulation of the Coca-Cola fortune was also among its most extravagant distributors. Not to his family, but to Atlanta, to Emory University, to hospitals, to cultural institutions, and to causes that reflected his own idiosyncratic and often private philanthropic priorities. It is estimated that Woodruff gave away, over the course of his lifetime, more than $400 million to charitable causes. In the currency of the 1960s and 1970s, when most of these gifts were made, this represented an almost unimaginable philanthropic commitment. He gave $100 million to Emory University in 1979. At the time, the largest single gift to an American university in history. He funded the construction of hospitals, art centers, and civic buildings across Atlanta with a consistency that transformed the city's infrastructure. He gave with the same disciplined, methodical quality that characterized his management of the company. Strategically, quietly, and always with an eye toward what the money would build rather than what it would purchase. He was also not an easy man to work for. Those who served under him at Coca-Cola described a leader who was demanding to the point of severity, who expected perfection as a baseline, and who communicated his expectations through implication and expectation rather than explicit instruction. He did not explain what he wanted. He expected to be understood. This quality, which made him formidable as a business leader, also created a culture at Coca-Cola that was, in the gentlest possible characterization, resistant to dissent. The company was run for decades as Woodruff's personal instrument. Decisions were made through relationships, not processes. The organization's formal structure was less important than one's proximity to the man himself. This worked brilliantly as long as Woodruff's judgment was sound. And for most of his tenure, it was. It created problems when his judgment faltered. And it created catastrophic problems when he was gone, and the institutional culture he had built had to function without its central intelligence. The New Coke episode, which occurred in the last year of Woodruff's life, was in part a product of this culture. The decision was made by a new generation of executives who had grown up in an organization that discouraged the kind of rigorous institutional dissent that might have prevented it. The research had been done. The blind tests had been conducted. But no one in the room was willing to stand up and say, "The data is right, and the conclusion is wrong." That kind of institutional courage requires organizations that reward it. Woodruff's Coca-Cola had not always rewarded it. He died on March 7, 1985, 3 days before Coca-Cola announced to its bottlers that the formula was changing. The timing was not coincidental. The executives who had wanted to change the formula had been waiting. The question of what Woodruff would have done, had he been fully present for the decision, is one that Coca-Cola insiders have debated for 40 years. The consensus among those who knew him is that he would not have changed the formula. He understood, in a visceral way that his successors had to learn through disaster, that the Coca-Cola brand was not a product attribute. It was an emotional covenant with the consumer. You do not renegotiate a covenant. You honor it. He left his estate primarily to the Robert W. Woodruff Foundation, which continues to operate as one of the largest charitable foundations in the American South. He left relatively little to his direct family. He had no children, and a great deal to the institutions he had spent his life building. His executor found, when the estate was inventoried, that Woodruff's personal holdings in Coca-Cola stock were less than most people expected. He had been giving it away for years. The Woodruff Foundation's endowment, however, which was heavily invested in Coca-Cola stock at the time of his death, has grown to a value that has sustained his philanthropic legacy for 4 decades and counting. He chose institutions over individuals. He chose legacy over liquidity. And the institutions he chose are still standing. The mansion he kept as his personal residence in Atlanta was, after his death, donated to an organization for civic use. The company he kept for 60 years is, at this writing, the most valuable non-alcoholic beverage brand in the world. The shares his foundation held have, in the 40 years since his death, multiplied in value by a factor that makes the word inheritance feel entirely inadequate. Woodruff understood something that the Candlers had not. He understood that the only mistake you could make with a genuinely great asset was to stop holding it. Chapter 7. Warren Buffett and the Trade of the Century. In 1988, 3 years after Robert Woodruff's death, and 1 year after the New Coke disaster had run its full arc and been corrected, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway began quietly purchasing shares of the Coca-Cola Company. Buffett invested approximately $1 billion in Coca-Cola stock between 1988 and 1994. This was, at the time, the largest single investment Berkshire Hathaway had ever made. It represented roughly a third of the total book value of the holding company. It was, by the standards of even institutional investment, an extraordinarily concentrated bet. The logic Buffett articulated for the investment was simple, and it was the same logic that the Candler family had failed to apply to their own inheritance. If you can identify a business with a durable competitive advantage, a moat in Buffett's terminology, the correct strategy is not to time the market or seek a better price. The correct strategy is to hold the asset for as long as the competitive advantage remains intact. Coca-Cola's moat, as Buffett analyzed it, was not the formula. It was not the distribution network, though that was formidable. It was not the manufacturing infrastructure or the bottling franchise system or the logistics capability. All of those things were real and valuable, but they were replicable, in theory, with sufficient capital. The moat was the brand, a brand that had been built over 100 years of continuous advertising, promotional activity, and emotional association. A brand that was served at the most significant moments of American cultural life, at sporting events, at holiday dinners, at military canteens, at the soda fountains where teenagers had their first dates. A brand so thoroughly embedded in the emotional landscape of the consumer that changing it had produced, as the New Coke episode demonstrated with empirical precision, a grief response in the population. You cannot build that in 5 years. You cannot acquire it for any finite sum. You can only inherit it, and the only way to inherit it is to have been patient enough to hold it long enough for it to accumulate. Buffett's billion-dollar investment, by 2023, was worth approximately $25 billion. His annual dividend income from Coca-Cola alone exceeds $700 million, meaning Berkshire receives, each year, more in dividends from Coca-Cola than Buffett originally paid for the entire stake. He has never sold a share. The contrast with the Candler family transaction is almost too clean to be historical fact. But it is. In 1919, the Candlers sold the entire Coca-Cola company for $25 million because that number seemed impossibly large to pass up. In 1988, Buffett invested $1 billion, 40 times the 1919 sale price, for approximately 7% of the company. And he has never considered selling, because the number in front of him, however large, is understood to be smaller than the number the same shares will represent in the future. The lesson is not that Buffett is smarter than the Candlers. The lesson is structural. The Candlers were operating within a framework that valued the tangible over the intangible, the immediate over the eventual, the house you could live in over the share certificate you had to trust. Buffett operated within a framework where the intangible, brand strength, consumer loyalty, competitive moat, was the primary object of analysis. The difference in outcome is not a difference in intelligence. It is a difference in how each party defined what was real. The Candlers defined what was real as what they could touch. The shares were abstract. The mansion was concrete. The stock was paper. The land was land. And so they traded the paper for the land and watched, from their concrete houses, as the paper became the most valuable thing that had ever passed through their hands. Chapter 8. The Children and Grandchildren. What the Dynasty Became. The Candler family did not disappear after the 1919 sale. They remained prominent figures in Atlanta's social, civic, and religious life for decades afterward. The $25 million they received was real money, extraordinary money by the standards of their time, and they used it in the ways that wealthy Southern families of their era typically used extraordinary money. They built larger houses. They donated to churches. They invested in Atlanta real estate, which, for several decades of the mid-20th century, rewarded their confidence. Asa Candler's son Howard, who had been the primary architect of the 1919 sale, purchased a vast estate outside Atlanta and proceeded to develop it with a comprehensiveness that reflected the ambitions of a man who believed he had secured his family's future in a durable and permanent form. He built stables. He installed a private golf course. He entertained with a lavishness that made the Candler family name synonymous in Atlanta society, with a particular brand of post-Confederate aristocratic confidence. The estate did not survive the century. The Atlanta real estate market that Howard Candler had invested in heavily was, by the 1960s and 1970s, undergoing transformations that could not have been predicted from the vantage point of 1919. Urban development patterns shifted. Suburban expansion moved in directions the old investments had not anticipated. Properties that had seemed like blue-chip assets in the 1920s were, by the 1960s, liabilities requiring maintenance budgets that the principal they had been purchased with could no longer service. Meanwhile, the Coca-Cola company was growing at a rate that the Candler family could now only observe as outsiders. Every year, every quarter, every earnings announcement was a reminder of what they had sold and what it had become. The family held no significant equity position. They had no board representation. They were, in the company's formal structure, simply members of the public, prominent members, with their name on the original founding documents and their patriarch's portrait in the company's lobby, but economically external. Asa Candler himself, in his final years, made donations that reflected both his extraordinary generosity and his complicated relationship with the wealth he had accumulated and the wealth his children had dispersed. He gave to Emory University. He gave to Methodist causes. He gave to Atlanta civic organizations with a consistency that his children could not have matched even had they wished to, because the $25 million had not compounded as the shares would have. He died in 1929, the same year the stock market collapsed. The timing is not metaphorically tidy. The crash did not specifically punish the Candler family, who had already converted their equity to cash a decade earlier. But it does provide a kind of historical punctuation. The old order ended. The new order, in which Coca-Cola was managed by the Woodruffs with an eye toward a future the Candlers had sold, was fully in place. The Candler Mansion on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Atlanta, one of the great houses of the city's Gilded Age, was sold. It passed through several owners and uses over the subsequent decades. It was converted at one point into a school. it was converted into other institutional uses. The specific domestic purpose for which it was built, the housing of an Atlanta dynasty, was not its permanent function. It had been purchased, in part, with the proceeds of the Coca-Cola Company. Charles Howard Candler Jr., Ace's grandson, who had lived his adult life in the shadow of the family's foundational decision, gave an interview late in his life in which he reflected on what it meant to be a Candler in the era of the company's global dominance. He spoke with a combination of pride and philosophical resignation that is the specific emotional register of people who understand they have witnessed a historical irony at close range. He was proud of what his grandfather built. He understood, with full clarity, what had been lost. He did not say it was a mistake. He said it was a decision that made sense at the time. This is the most honest thing you can say about it. The Candlers were not fools. They were not reckless. They were people who made a rational decision using the information and the framework available to them. The market, which operates on information they did not have and could not have had, disagreed. The market is not sentimental. It does not care about the reasoning. It only records the outcome. The Callenwold Mansion, Asa Candler's masterpiece of residential architecture in Druid Hills, survives today as a fine arts center operated for the benefit of the Atlanta community. It is, objectively, a more democratic use of the building than its original purpose. It is open to the public. It hosts concerts, classes, and community events. The grounds are beautifully maintained. The architecture is celebrated. The irony is inscribed in the institutional use itself. The house that Coca-Cola built is no longer a private Candler residence. It is a public good. The irony required no explanation. Chapter 9. The brand that outlived everyone who built it. There is a quality that belongs to the very greatest commercial enterprises, to the institutions that endure not just for a generation but across multiple centuries. And it is not the quality most people assume. It is not the formula. It is not the founder's vision, however brilliant. It is not the quality of the original product, however superior. The quality is this: the capacity to absorb successive generations of human error without losing the fundamental properties that made it valuable in the first place. The Coca-Cola Company has absorbed an extraordinary amount of human error. It absorbed Pemberton's financial desperation and the chaotic fragmentation of the original ownership structure. It absorbed Candler's decision to give away the bottling rights for $1. It absorbed the 1919 sale, which undervalued the company by a factor that grows more embarrassing with every passing decade. It absorbed New Coke. It absorbed the various diversification experiments that the company undertook in the 1970s and 1980s. The acquisition of Columbia Pictures, the foray into wine production, the various non-beverage businesses that seemed reasonable at the time and were subsequently divested, with patient structural good humor. The brand survived every mistake because the brand was not, by this point, a product. It was an institution. And institutions, once they achieve sufficient cultural mass, have a kind of inertia that individual decisions cannot overcome. The people making the decisions believed they were steering the ship. The ship was, in a meaningful sense, steering itself. This is both the wonder and the tragedy of the Coca-Cola story. The wonder is that something so improbable, a medicinal tonic developed by a morphine-dependent Confederate veteran in an Atlanta apothecary, could become, within a century, a global cultural institution consumed in virtually every country on Earth. The tragedy is that the people most directly responsible for this achievement, the founders, the families, the dynasts, were, by the time the achievement was complete, largely economically disconnected from it. The Pemberton family had nothing. John Pemberton died in debt, having sold his formula for whatever anyone would pay him in the final months of his life. His son Charles, who had inherited his father's dependency issues, died young and in poverty. The formula that John Pemberton created was worth, at the time of his death, essentially nothing to his family, and by the end of the 20th century, a sum so large it could not be expressed without resorting to the vocabulary of national economies. The Candler family had converted their equity to real estate and cash in 1919 and watched from comfortable, but not dynastic circumstances, as the company grew to dwarf every financial decision they had ever made. The Woodruff family, or rather, the Woodruff Foundation, since Robert Woodruff died without children, retained significant equity and used it to fund the philanthropic infrastructure of an American city, which is a genuinely remarkable outcome, but is not the same as the generational family wealth that the original asset could have generated. And the investors who bought and held, who looked at the company in 1950 or 1960 or 1988 and decided that patience was the appropriate strategy, are, in the aggregate, the people who captured the full value of what Pemberton's formula created. They had no personal connection to the brand. They had not invented it, or built it, or sacrificed for it, or watched it grow from a single soda fountain in Atlanta to a global institution. They had simply identified it as what it was, a compounding machine, and declined to get in its way. The irony is structural, and it is cruel. The people who built Coca-Cola did not hold Coca-Cola. The people who held Coca-Cola did not build it. The value flowed not to the creators or the custodians, but to the patient, the disciplined, and the uninvolved. By 2023, the Coca-Cola Company employed approximately 79,000 people. It operated in over 200 countries and territories. It sold more than 2 billion servings of its products per day, across its full portfolio, which includes hundreds of brands beyond the original flagship. Its market capitalization placed it among the most valuable companies on Earth. The red and white logo is, by multiple measures, the most recognized visual symbol in human history, more widely recognized than the symbols of any government, religion, or cultural institution on the planet. John Pemberton's 5-cent glass of brown syrup, served at a soda fountain in Atlanta in 1886, had become this. The soda fountain at Jacob's Pharmacy is gone. The pharmacy itself is gone. The Atlanta that Pemberton and Candler and Woodruff inhabited, a provincial southern city of the Gilded Age, rebuilding from Civil War devastation, constructing its identity around commerce and religion and the performance of gentility, is gone in the form they knew it. The drink is still here. And this is, ultimately, the thing that makes the Coca-Cola story not merely a business history, but a philosophical document. It is a case study in the difference between building a thing and owning a thing. Pemberton built it. Candler built it further. Woodruff built it to institutional scale. And at each transfer of ownership, the builders received less than the holders. The creators were compensated for their labor. The compound interest went to the patient. There is no villain in this story. Pemberton sold what he had to sell because he was dying and he needed the money. The Candler children sold what they had inherited because $25 million was a number their framework could not accommodate without action. The Woodruff Foundation held because its institutional mandate required it, not because any individual made a noble choice. And Warren Buffett held because his entire intellectual framework was built around the proposition that holding is the sophisticated choice, not the passive one. The drink did not care. The drink just kept being drunk. 2 billion servings a day. Every day. In 200 countries. By people who, in the vast majority of cases, have no knowledge of and no particular interest in the names Pemberton, Candler, or Woodruff. People who are simply thirsty and who reach, as human beings have been reaching for 137 years, for the familiar red can. Every one of those servings is a small, quiet verdict on the decisions that were made in Atlanta between 1888 and 1919. Every one of them says the same thing. Chapter 10, The Price of Impatience. We began this story with a funeral. On that March morning in 1888, the pharmacists of Atlanta walked through the spring heat to bury John Stith Pemberton, who had created something extraordinary and received almost nothing for it. He was mourned by his professional community with genuine feeling. He was mourned, less publicly, by a small circle of business partners who understood that the asset he had sold in pieces was worth substantially more assembled than anyone had paid for it. He was not mourned by anyone who could then, in 1888, have told you what the thing he had built was going to become. No one could have told you that. The numbers did not yet exist in human experience to express that kind of commercial compounding. The vocabulary for it, the billions, the global distribution infrastructure, the brand equity, the cultural mythology, had not yet been invented. This is the generous reading of the story. The Candlers and the Pembertons and the various parties who sold their stakes too early were not foolish. They were temporally limited. They were making decisions in the present using frameworks built for a world that was already, without their knowledge, being superseded. The less generous reading is also true. The Candlers knew, by 1919, what the Coca-Cola Company was. They had watched it for 30 years. They had seen the growth. They had counted the receipts. They were not operating on Pemberton's 1886 ignorance. They had 30 years of compounding evidence in front of them, and they looked at it and chose the $25 million anyway. Both readings are necessary because the story contains both truths simultaneously. It is a story about the limits of human imagination in the face of exponential growth. It is also a story about the specific, recurring, deeply human failure to value the future as highly as the present. These are not the same failure, but they produce the same outcome. The outcome is this. The family that created Coca-Cola chose houses over shares, spectacle over patience. The houses crumbled. The stock only climbed. This sentence, and the history it summarizes, has been repeated in 1,000 forms across the full span of commercial history. It is the story of the original investors in Standard Oil who sold to Rockefeller early. It is the story of the early employees at Ford who cashed out their equity for cash bonuses. It is, in some form, the story of every transformational company that has ever existed. The people who built the earliest and most essential pieces of the enterprise were not, in most cases, the people who captured the largest share of the value it eventually created. The value went to the patient. The value always goes to the patient. Robert Woodruff's foundation understood this. Warren Buffett understood this. And the peculiar, painful irony of the Coca-Cola story is that the person who understood it most completely, who built his entire 60-year management tenure around the principle of patient accumulation and institutional discipline, was also the person who received the company as the beneficiary of the Candler family's impatience. Woodruff was patient because he had the luxury of patience. The Candlers, having sold their patience for $25 million, could only observe the results. John Pemberton's grave is in Linwood Cemetery in Columbus, Georgia. It is a modest stone in a section of the cemetery that does not receive a great deal of tourist traffic. His obituary, when it ran in the Atlanta papers in August 1888, described him as a druggist and a gentleman. It mentioned his service in the Confederate cavalry. It mentioned his experiments with medicinal compounds. It did not mention Coca-Cola by name, because at the time of his death, Coca-Cola was not yet famous enough to constitute a biographical footnote. By the time Coca-Cola was famous enough to constitute a biographical entry for Pemberton, Pemberton's family had nothing to show for it. The Candler Mansion on Ponce de Leon is a fine arts center. The bottling franchise that Asa Candler sold for $1 is the most successful distribution infrastructure in beverage history. The formula that Pemberton sold in fragments for a few $100s is stored in a vault in Atlanta and insured for an amount that is not publicly disclosed but is understood, by those familiar with the company's valuation of its intellectual property, to be quite large. The pharmacists who walked through the summer heat to bury John Pemberton on that March morning could not have known what they were burying alongside him. They were burying a man who had, in the final desperate years of his life, done something genuinely extraordinary, created a product so well suited to its moment and its market that it would outlast every person who had ever touched it. They could not know that the formula in his notebook would become, within a century, the most widely distributed product in human history. They only knew he was gone. They only knew the stores would open again tomorrow. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of the Coca-Cola dynasty. The great assets of commercial history do not belong to the people who created them, or the families that inherited them, or the dynasties that fought over them. They belong to time. They belong to the patient investor and the faithful consumer and the quiet, compounding arithmetic of decades that no individual human drama can fully interrupt. The drink outlasted the inventor, the family, the dynasty, and the fortune. It is being consumed, right now, somewhere on this planet, 2 million times an hour, by people who could not name Pemberton or Candler or Woodruff, by people who are simply reaching for the familiar, the comfortable, the thing that tastes the same today as it tasted when their parents drank it and their grandparents before them. 5 cents a glass. Then, now a global institution worth $250 billion. The wound that started it all was Pemberton's. The patience that finished it belongs to anyone willing to hold.